You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia, with me, Juliet Spare. Gendercide, female feticide, sex selection abortions. An investigation by the independent newspaper has revealed that illegal abortion is being widely used by some UK ethnic groups to avoid having daughters. Its statistical analysis of data from the 2011 national census suggests widespread discrepancies in the sex ratio of children in some immigrant families. The data shows a reduction of the female population by between 1,500 and 4,700, suggesting that gender-based abortions may also be occurring among women living in England and Wales who were born in India and Nepal. Meanwhile, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service has warned that the report by The Independent, which claims that sex-selective abortions of female fetuses is widespread in communities, could undermine women's rights. So to take part in the discussion, I'm joined by Steve Connor, science editor of The Independent and author of the article The Lost Girls. Maura Clarke, founder and director of Abortion Support Network, an almost entirely volunteer-run charity that helps women travelling from Ireland and Northern Ireland to access safe and legal abortions. Frances Ryan, a journalist for The Guardian and New Statesmen, who says sex-selective abortion is misogyny disguised as feminism. And Furedi, who's chief executive of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which provides around a third of all abortions in the UK. And Priya Shah, a politics and international relations finalist at Warwick University. So I think I'm going to start with you first, Steve Connor. Tell us what you found and tell us how you went about coming to the conclusions that you did in your article.
The genesis of this story goes back a couple of years ago now, when I was writing a story about a Canadian study which looked at immigrant mothers to Canada to see whether gender-selective abortions were going on there. And the way they did this was to look at the second-born child. And fundamentally, you're asking the question, does the sex of an elder child affect the sex of a younger child, of the second-born child? Now, the answer to that biologically is no, it shouldn't. The null hypothesis you're testing is that there should be no effect of having either a daughter or a son as the firstborn child on the sex of the second-born child. So I was wondering whether some similar research had been done in the UK, and fundamentally it really hadn't been done. So I approached the Office for National Statistics, which keeps the national census records for 2011. And to cut a long story short, it took a long time to get them to have a look at this data because it's a very complicated process. But they were able to come up with data about the makeup of families based on the place of birth of the mother and the father. And I was particularly interested in some countries which there was a suspicion that gender-selective abortions were going on in those countries. So we looked at a number of countries in Asia, and we also had a comparison with mothers and fathers born in the UK, born in Europe, born in America and the Caribbean. And what we were looking for is to test this idea. Does having a daughter effectively raise your likelihood of having a son as a second-born child? And we found that in certain countries of birth of mothers and fathers, this was the case. And when I did a rudimentary statistical analysis myself with the help of a statistician, we found it was statistically significant. Now, to make sure that our data was really valid and not the result of some kind of statistical chicanery, we went to Imperial College London and we asked a team of statisticians there to look at it. And these statisticians are basically people who check the statistics of scientists themselves. I mean, they are the one guy who did this was first rate, probably one of the best statisticians we have in the UK. He basically validated the results. He tried to test it to destruction. He came up with an interesting alternative hypothesis, but this hypothesis, although could explain some of the anomalies we've seen, couldn't explain all of them. So the basic conclusion is there is now evidence, statistical evidence, of sex-selective abortions taking place in the UK. We don't know whether these abortions are actually taking place in the UK or abroad, but nevertheless it's affecting the gender ratio of certain immigrant groups within the UK, within England and Wales to be specific.
Can you be specific about which particular immigrant groups?
Well, you can run various statistical tests on this. Now, the ones that are most highly statistically significant are mothers born in Pakistan, mothers born in Afghanistan and Nepal. There was also some evidence of statistical significance in India as well. Now, there are wider countries as well. I mean, we looked at China, and again, the results there was indicative of some kind of gender imbalances, but that wasn't really statistically significant. I usually deal with scientists, and they're a pretty dry academic lot. And I was surprised at really just the reaction we got from the immigrant community themselves. There was one woman who rang me. She didn't want to give me her name initially, but she did eventually feel comfortable enough with giving me her name, but I promised not to reveal it. She's a British Asian woman, and she just basically said, "Thank you very much for writing about this, because I thought really I was on my own." She'd had 2 abortions because she was carrying girls, and it was quite clear to me that she herself felt pressurised by either her husband or her husband's family to have those abortions. And she said to me, quote, she is terrified that it will happen again. She was 10 weeks pregnant and due to have an ultrasound scan in a few weeks' time.
I think I'll come to you now, Anne Furedi, Chief Executive of the British Pregnancy British Pregnancy Advice Service. You suggest that this report by The Independent undermines women's rights.
Let me say first of all, I'm definitely not suggesting that any scientific study or any look at figures should not be published because of its consequences. And I work in abortion full time, and believe me, I'm fascinated by it. I want more data. I want more information about what's going on. But what I'm concerned about here is, first of all, that it does seem that an enormous storm has been raised by the publication of conclusions that I'm not terribly convinced are sound in the way that Steve does. And I've known Steve as a journalist for a long time and respect him enormously. But the statistics that he's talking about here, as he said, are drawn from census data. Now, census data is based on forms that people fill in for themselves and submit on the basis of how many people are in their family households at particular times. And frankly, they're not known for their statistical certainty. You may remember a couple of years ago there was a big campaign for people to register themselves on the census as Jedi Knights to cock a snook at the way that the government defined religious groups in society. So what I'm concerned about is that the Department of Health, because it was interested in the issue of sex selection, carried out its own study that looked at the birth data and the conception data that is mandatorily reported by hospitals and doctors, and it found no evidence of a problem of sex selection abortion in Britain. And it seems to me that, which is a really sound study, has kind of been pushed to one side, and there is now this discussion on the basis of census data, which is far less accurate. Now, having said that, put that aside about the study, no woman should ever be forced into an abortion that she doesn't want to have. Abortion clinics spend a lot of time counselling women and seeing women on their own to make sure that they are properly consenting to any procedure. And of course it's appalling when women are placed under pressure, but I similarly think it's appalling for Steve's paper, on the basis of this study that he's produced, to be simply demanding that something is done about whether or not women should have access to antenatal scan results. And I think that that's where I'm concerned about women's rights being undermined, when you draw the conclusion that women should not have access to information about their pregnancy in case they make wrong decisions. You're wrong to say that data on abortion and births isn't collected. Abortion data is collected in absolute minute detail. The addresses of women, the age of women, whether they're married or not, whether they have children or not, whether they've had previous abortions or not, all of that is collected for every abortion that takes place. The ethnic background of the women, their doctor's address, it's all there, and it's all there for scrutiny. Now, what I'm saying is that if we're going to have discussions on the basis of what does and what doesn't happen with abortion, let's really look at it, and let's mine down into that. If Steve is saying, oh, the census shows that in general people are reporting different things about their family size, then that's an entirely different discussion than the discussion about whether sex selection abortion is taking place in Britain, and it certainly should not lead to a discussion about women being denied access to information about pregnancy scans.
I'm going to come to Mara Clarke next, who's the founder and director of Abortion Support Network.
We deal exclusively with women who are living in Ireland and Northern Ireland, who are, of course, forced to travel over to England to access a safe and legal abortion because abortion is so restricted in Ireland and Northern Ireland. I just wanted to say that I absolutely agree with what Anne said, that no woman should ever feel pressured into having an abortion that she doesn't want. And when it comes to gender selection, all of the cases that I've heard of from people who work in clinics, not that there have been tons and tons of those cases, but it's definitely cases of, for instance, a young couple, a young Asian couple living with the husband's family, and the family said, right, if the first child is a girl, we will throw you out. And so, I mean, that's a horrible, horrible situation for those people to be in. But to me, this isn't, when you're talking about gender selection, you're not actually talking about abortion. You're talking about societies that in some cases devalue girls. And so to me, that's what we need to work on, is if this is happening, what we need to work on is making sure that societies are valuing female children as much as they're valuing male children, and that the solution to that is not, in the instance of the case that I just quoted, turfing out a young couple on the street with a newborn. The other thing I wanted to mention is, for instance, with the Abortion Support Network, we have actually helped 3 couples come over who were getting gender selective terminations, but they were actually terminating boys. Because in all 3 cases, they had genetic disorders that were passed through the males. And in 2 of the 3 cases, the couples already had a child with the condition and basically did not feel that they could have another child with the condition. All 3 couples were using birth control, just to make the point that abortion sometimes happens because often happens because contraceptive methods fail. So all 3 of these couples were using contraception. All 3 of these couples were very conscious of what could happen if they had a male child. But when they fell pregnant, all 3 decided that they would wait to see whether or not they were having a girl or a boy, in the hopes that they could have a girl who would be healthy and everything else. And for us, we've never judged women's reasons for having terminations. We don't believe that there's good abortions and there's bad abortions. With us, it's just about any restriction that you put on terminations just makes it so that women with money have options and women without money don't.
Priya Shah, having heard from Steve Connor here, Mara Clarke and Anne Furedi from the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, what would you like to say?
It is a deep-rooted misogyny, and what happens is when people migrate from these countries in South Asia, such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, even parts of India, they usually locate in the same sort of areas. For example, you might have lots of Bangladesh people in East London, for example. So what they've done is they've brought their way of thinking, all of these kind of deep-rooted ideas with them, and these ideas are not going to go anywhere because they're all kind of concentrated in the same area. So they aren't really being exposed to what is wrong with sex-selective abortion and that sort of thing. So I think first and foremost, it is really important to educate and to ensure that these women have information about family planning, and to also highlight the impact of sex-selective abortion, what the wider implications would be. For example, in certain states in India, you've got huge disparities between boys and girls, and in the future, this is just going to continue to happen unless it is intervened at an early stage. So I think in order to prevent it in this country, education about family planning and that sort of thing is really important.
Frances Ryan, you wrote an article recently for the New Statesmen saying that campaigns against sex-selective abortion are misogyny disguised as feminism. Do you think the sex selection abortion debate has opened the wrong debate?
I think what Anne was saying earlier was really important, actually, that difference between, yes, having these discussions, but we should be very vigilant, I think, over how we have them and where they're leading. I think it's very worrying how easily these sort of reports can lead to certain groups of people, anti-choice campaigners, for instance, who wish to chip away at women's rights to an abortion, can use these sort of stories to further their own anti-choice agenda. And they do so very worryingly by sort of painting themselves as actually the real defenders of women. There's a massive sort of dark irony there. And I think it is it's a form of misogyny in feminist clothing, because actually, they can dress themselves up as actually the people who are furthering the interests of women. When, of course, I think anyone who truly defends women would be very concerned about any agenda that was trying to withhold any of our rights. I think, this discussion is important, as Anne says, but we have to be very vigilant, I think, of how these discussions are taking place and what certain people who wish to take them to another path, how they are furthering their own agenda through that. I think when you look at some of the cases mentioned in the Independence reports, for instance, pregnant women who anecdotally were stating that they couldn't produce a daughter, the issue isn't simply that a female child wasn't wanted. It was that having a female child would bring risk to the mother's life. And that, I think, is a really important distinction as well. Cases where in-laws were being violent towards the pregnant woman, threatening her if she didn't produce a son. This is clearly deeply, deeply worrying. But our response, should be far more complicated than a move to tighten abortion laws or, not allowing parents to know the sex of their future child, which the Independent story pointed, as Anne said, as a likely consequence of this report. I think if we're not very, very careful, we get to a point where we're sort of convincing ourselves that the best way to empower women is to withhold information from them about their own pregnancy. And the best response to women's societal inequality should be to reduce women's rights over their own body. And that's a really, really worrying path, I think, that we have to be very, very vigilant that we're not going to go down.
Steve, would you like to respond?
Yeah, there's a couple of points I'd like to raise with Anne. Firstly, it's not true that everything is collected in terms of abortion. We don't collect data on the gender of the aborted fetus. Very often, of course, that's difficult to do, impossible to do, perhaps, with medically induced abortions. The other thing is, she says we can't rely on census data. Well, I'm sorry, but that's just plain wrong. Governments rely on census data. Statisticians, demographers rely on census data. To say that the Department of Health study was better than the study we did, actually, it's not as statistically as valid, because they looked at broad sex ratios at birth. They didn't actually test that null hypothesis that I talked about previously. And to say that we should prevent or resist the imposition of banning the scan data to mothers, I don't think anyone's suggesting that. They're saying, why don't they delay it until maybe the 24th week? That would give people ample enough time to plan for whether it's a boy or a girl. The other issue I'd just like to point out is, yes, true, what's really going to change here is society's attitude towards having daughters. And that's the real issue at stake here. And if I just point to one important country, which is South Korea, they had a big problem with sex-selective abortions based on female fetuses about 10, 15 years ago. There was a national campaign to increase the value of daughters that had a dramatic effect. And now I understand that the sex ratio at birth numbers are more or less the same as Europe and other parts of the world. So yes, the big issue here is actually valuing women from birth, as it were, and valuing daughters in particular.
And do you want to respond? Otherwise, I was...
Yeah,
Go on.
I mean, look, the thing is that I think were it the case that there was a real imbalance in the gender of children that were being born, it would be absolutely right to be looking at the reasons behind that. But the point that I'm really sticking to with this is that does not appear to be the case in Britain. And believe me, when the Department of Health were looking at this issue, they were very, very motivated to determine any reasons for it. Firstly, because they were, I think, chairing the Council of Europe at the time that the study was commissioned, and the Council was very concerned about it, and so they really did look at it. And secondly, because another newspaper had launched this story into the world by apparently doing an undercover investigation of what was going on in abortion clinics. And so our regulators were required to come in and inspect to find out whether sex selection abortions were going on, and they found no evidence of it either. So I just think that we have to be really careful about what we identify as problems and whether or not, and what really the agenda is that's behind it. For me, I think if you looked at what are the problems with abortion in this country, what problems do women face, it's not going to be that they're forced into abortions. In fact, if the paper really wanted to throw itself behind a good campaign, I would suggest it threw itself behind the campaign supporting Mara's group on why it is that women in Northern Ireland don't have the kind of access to abortion that women have in the UK. And secondly, I think that honestly, to say that women should have any information held back from them in pregnancy, even to make the point that, well, it doesn't really matter if you're just delaying scan results to 24 weeks, is frankly appalling. Why should doctors not give me or any other woman information about my pregnancy because they disapprove of decisions that I may take as a result of it? I think it's a scandalous suggestion. We should trust women to make decisions that are right for them.
I just sort of like to make the general point that Anne has made statements saying that, her organisation has made statements saying that the independence study was full of statistical chicanery. She's basically saying there is no evidence of this taking place in the UK. Now, we have two lines of evidence which have emerged over the last couple of weeks. One is our own statistics, as we published in The Independent, which have been validated by Imperial College, and the Department of Health is now investigating it. And the second line of evidence is anecdotal reports. We have now overwhelming number of anecdotal reports of people who say this has happened to them, it's happened to family members, it's happened to people they know. Can Anne now say, does she still think there is no evidence for sex-selective abortions in the UK?
If you're asking me directly, what I can say is that if you talk to people who provide services, they will tell you that women are not forced into abortions against their will, that a huge amount of time is spent counselling women, making sure that women are seen on their own, to make sure that abortions are carried out only when a woman has fully consented to it and in circumstances where she is requesting it. And I think that the point that Mara made earlier about the reasons why women request abortions are hugely complex. Now, I think you have to think where you are going in terms of policy on this. Are you seriously saying that it should be made more difficult for women from certain ethnic backgrounds, or indeed from all ethnic backgrounds, to obtain abortions that they request?
No, I'm not. Not at all.
So what do you want to see? So Steve, what do you want to see change?
Well, the fundamental fact is that it's illegal in this country to have an abortion based on gender alone, and you know that as well as I do. Okay, so what happens is people are having ultrasound tests that determine the sex of their fetus, and then they're requesting abortion for other reasons. Now, you might say there's no evidence of that taking place in the UK. Fair enough. I think there is evidence. If there is even a question of evidence about it, we should actually investigate it.
What are you suggesting? Are you then suggesting then that when women request abortions, they should have lie detector tests to make sure that there isn't some reason behind it? How do you see that this situation is going to be stopped? It seems to me what you're saying is that you've got a concern that some women are requesting abortions on grounds that you think are bad reasons.
It's not me. It's actually illegal.
Prevented from doing that.
Well, no, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm only, if we have a perceived problem in this country, first of all, we must actually admit that we might have a problem. That would be a start, and then we can address the issue of how to get around it. I've suggested, well, there's one possible reason way around it. We could actually delay the point at which women are told what sex their child is, their fetus is. The other much more important response is educating people about the value of daughters. That's what I've said, and I hold to that.
But can I discuss? I mean,
briefly, Anne, because we are coming to an end of the discussion, and whilst it's fascinating to hear the debate continue, I do want to just get final words from everyone else who has been good enough to join us. So, finally, Anne, last point.
Well, I just remain thinking that it is truly shocking that anyone can suggest that a woman should be denied information about her pregnancy, whether there's a medical need for it or not, and that Steve, as a journalist, should think that because he disapproves of something, a woman should not be given information that could enable her to make a decision. Who makes him God?
I think we'll go back to one of Steve's points that he made, was that it addresses society's attitude towards having daughters, which brings me nicely to what you said in the beginning, Priya Shah, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So if you just would, having heard the discussion, make a final point.
I don't think it's about withholding information from these women, because usually there are lots of interrelated problems which are at stake over here. Usually these women may have been forced into a marriage, they may have other cultural issues. So it's not about holding information, because that's just going to make their situation a lot worse. If you hold information from a woman who is being pressured into a pregnancy to have a boy, she is only going to feel pressured from her family even further. It's more about helping these high-risk women and also ensuring that they make the right choice by giving them the actual support that they may need because of these other problems which they may also be engaged in. So it's not just about isolating them and not giving them information. That would be a huge step back in an age where we have been given the chance to receive such information about what the sex may be of a child. So to actually hold that information is taking a huge step back. So helping high-risk women is the main thing, I would say.
A final comment from you, Frances Ryan.
I think that we need to be essentially very clear that it's working against the structural inequalities, the culture that says girls are less valuable in some way, that puts women often in economic, social and often physically vulnerable positions. That's how we're going to reach any point of equality. It is not paternalistically monitoring or reducing women's bodily choices or rights. I think that's the most important point.
Sadly, we've come to the end of the discussion, but I'd like to thank all my guests: Steve Connor, Science Editor of The Independent, and Furedi, Chief Executive of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, Mara Clarke, Founder and Director of Abortion Support Network, journalist Frances Ryan, and Priya Shah, a Politics and International Relations finalist at Warwick University.